So I'm going to go to a second recording, aware of the fact that you are actually seeing my screen here. So I need to make sure that my presentation, which you'll see over on this side, is big enough for you. These lectures will be on YouTube, available to you all out there. Obviously, we've got PDF on one side, or the presentation we're dealing with. We've got text all over there as well. Little me in the middle. How are you doing? Little me's not very well today, and making a bit of a meal of it, obviously. If we start off here where we were, we've looked through and talked about the Gothic. We've talked about it as a genre, its many associated genres and subgenres. We've talked about genre conventions, which could be described in many other ways, elements of the Gothic, or we also use the word tropes, which is terribly clever, but not entirely necessary. Features we could speak about as well. We looked through them and we discussed them in relation to some particularly works of female Gothic in the 19th century, and then we related them down to various set texts from Module 1, which I'm hoping you're accessing and in as many ways as possible. Whether it's some of the online reading you can do, whether it's some of the audiobooks, or simply looking at the films, etc. For the classics as well, for those of you who seem to be interested, there's quite a few versions of things like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, etc., which are well worth the entry fee. I'm just going to get rid of that record thing as we move here. I just mentioned earlier, very, very good book indeed. Jonathan Strange and Eddie Marsden playing Mr. Norrell. The premise that magic is real, set in the time of Wellington, so in the very same time frame that we're looking for the Gothic and Jane Austen, for example. Northanger Abbey was written, I think, in 1803. I think it was finished, but not published until 1817, if I'm right. So we're very much in that sort of era. That's pre-Victorian Georgian Britain. And it's a fantastic adaptation that these two star in as well. That's well worth seeing. I think it's a 7-parter by the BBC. Before everything went pear-shaped for the BBC recently, some of their adaptations have not been up to scratch for me. This is called Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and it's a rollicking read. It's fantastic. It's well worth it. It's got lots of lore and folklore and magic and the old ways, and yet it's set in a realistic, historical, fictional sort of context, under the premise that there are magicians, and these are two rival magicians competing within the realm. So they're two characters, I suppose, protagonist and antagonist. We very much favour Jonathan Strange as the protagonist, from whom the story is chiefly, whose perspective, or who we chiefly follow in the story, though he does not narrate it. He's not the storyteller. And his antagonist is Mr. Norrell, who at first we think is possibly a villain. However, that's as may be. Things perhaps turn out not to be so simple. So we were talking about characters last week. We were talking about fairy tale characters and the sort of stock characters of romance and fairy tales. There's Bela Lugosi appearing as Dracula in a silent movie version from the 20th century. Fantastic. Again, you see that sort of element of sort of fakery with film as well to create this wonderful, wonderful Gothic feel. So terms we might be using as we may be talking about protagonists, potentially about antagonists. I think we mentioned sort of adversary and arch nemesis or nemesis in terms of Sherlock Holmes last week. We have often a hero villain or hero and heroine, of course. And then we have the role of the anti-hero, the hero who doesn't seem to have traditionally heroic qualities, as heroic qualities would be seen through the genres of romance. Napoleon being a great hero of the Romantic age, for example, the soldier king, philosopher. Yes, against antagonism. To be antagonistic is to be difficult and feisty, and to be just sort of not nice to somebody, basically. That was very antagonistic. So an antagonist is generally the villain, and he's the protagonist, would be the hero. But these are far more neutral. No, Peter, an anti-hero is generally actually the hero. For example, let me just put this into very clear terms. If any of you have ever read the original Batman series by Frank Miller, which the sort of Ben Affleck character tries to represent a little bit more. In that, Batman, he's not a hero at all. He's an anti-hero. He's middle-aged, washed up, drunk. And even when he does become a hero, it's in this sort of, it's not with the traditional, it's very gothic, and it's not with the traditional. Oh, have I stopped here? Is my audio still going? It's not with the traditional qualities of a hero, of a heroic, impressive, beautiful character, such as a knight in a courtly romance. A protagonist could be just the main character that we follow. It's clear to say that even though you can get multiple narratives and you can have films and books which seemingly don't follow one character, to a degree, yeah. Yes. You'll see as well when we look at diaries how nearly every hero is an anti-hero. If you look at Game of Thrones, for example, it's told through multiple narratives. We don't really have a feeling of who the protagonist is because we follow so many storylines, but essentially we're rooting for the Stark family more than anything else in the beginning, because we follow them more than anything else, even though there are lots of other stories going on in the first book, Game of Thrones. A foil is often what we'd call sort of a cameo these days as well, or a sidekick to a protagonist or main character. Dramatis personae, as in a persona is any character in a drama. Again, these are all sort of left over from Greek terms, and these are sort of loose terms we might use. Important thing is to remember is just like tragedy, it had a very fixed meaning in Greek drama, and then it's still used. It was used to describe Shakespeare's plays, and then later we still talk about tragedy, but we don't have the same fixed what you could call schemata. If anybody's read the or schema, the chapter on reading and understanding texts in Munden, which I didn't specify, but which follows this kind of reading thing I'm going to point to a little bit up today. That we don't have the same expectations of the form and of the genre and the same conventions anymore, but we still have these kind of words and terms. But they are quite useful, the anti-hero and the hero and protagonist, definitely, because we always have a protagonist. And if we don't, we often feel quite dissatisfied with the text. We need to be on somebody's side. We're quite simple creatures, I believe at least. So moving on from this sort of list of characters, and we can add to that all our stock characters that we began to sort of look at last week in terms of fairy tales as well. We can think about how a characterization takes place. Be quite careful with the time here because I'm going to give you only one sort of task if you've got time for it today, and then we're going to come back and look at reading skills. Direct characterization is when the narrator or the author, they could be separate, they could be the same thing, tells us about the character. Indirect characterization, another useful term and a good way to think about how we're going to work with writing and reading, particularly in the classroom, all the way through. I'm not saying this is just for secondary school as well. This can be from reading strategies and understanding genres is there from year 4 onwards. And still we can think about characters before then. Indirect characterization is what the character shows us and we're not told. So we've got, in the first point, we've got telling, as in a narrative, and in the second, we've got being shown something. It's still mediated in a narrative, But it's, for example, if we thought about a film, when we see somebody in a film, we don't think that there's a narrator. The camera is choosing what to show us. It's mediated, but then we've just been shown visually. So direct characterization, you need to think about person, perspective, and point of view, who the narrator is. Indirect characterization, it's a steal. Aha! Here's a simple mnemonic. Speech, thoughts, effects on others. Speech, if we hear it, could be still, we might be being related. We don't know by being told that, though it's still considered indirect. Thoughts, who's telling us? How do we know those thoughts? Effects is perhaps easier to see as clearly indirect, and actions, because again they are mediated through narration, and they could be from different perspectives, and looks as well. But we can think about, okay, what's a character saying? What's a character thinking? What effect does a character have on others? What does a character do? What does a character look like? And this is quite a useful sort of little approach to working with and on characterization, which will start off today and hopefully sort of develop a little bit. Other ways of looking at organization, you can think about chronology. When we look at the Baudelaires, because we're going to have a little look at the description of the Baudelaires. I know that's on the list for 5 to 10s, but I've actually uploaded a vocabulary primer to work with the bad beginning on the 102 side. I'll put on the 502 side as well. There's a chronological element in terms of time, how it's organized. There can be spatial in terms of location. It could be, you could organize your characterization in order of importance or unimportance, which is a good way to play some games with that. You can try and come up with 3 unimportant facts about a character, peripheral to the central plot. So when describing a person, you might begin with physical description, how they think, feel, or act, for example, as well. Very much similar to the steal mnemonic we looked at earlier. And so that's a way of sort of thinking about how, what types of characterization there are and how you do it. And that's very important for writing, but it's also important for reading and the interplay of reading and writing. I am the weaver. We know that readers make good writers because they know stock characters and genre conventions, tropes and motifs. Just beginning to sort of up the ante in some of the game. Now we've got, when we looked at fairy tales, and folklore is very heavily bound up with all of this as well, we had this sort of puppet show. I described it as a gothic phantasmagoria at one point, I think. We've got this 2D world without an interior life. But here, when we're looking at characterization, there's also literal language as one division, and then we're going to look at figurative language, okay? And literal language is say what you see. There's a one-to-one correspondence between what you're describing and the world around it. Figurative language is what you say about the world around it is not the same. You could epistemologically question that very, very heavily, but that's a sort of useful functional sort of working description there. And sensory description, which is appealing to the senses. And we can think about the exterior world in terms of sensory input through sight and smell and touch and hearing, etc. And we can think about all the sensory input, and then we can think about that's coming from outside, and we can think about the interior life and the psychology, the feelings and mental states and processes of a character. Through literal language, we can simply describe that. We could also use figurative language. Some other little elements that we've already begun to work with. We talked about varying length of sentences. Short sentences seem to literally mimic the world in that they create pace in a text. And in a Gothic text, in a lot of the text you'll be reading right now, there will be pacey short sentences to show that the plot is quickening, that the events are tightening up, and they can be used quite importantly at certain certain parts, in the same way that I think you might want to think about the fact that in some of the descriptions coming up, longer sentences as well have a very strong effect on the reader. They slow things down, and they give you a passive role as a reader as well. Other literal language, evocative verbs can create mood or atmosphere, and very important when thinking about setting, which is something we'll look into at greater length later. Precision in terms of sentence length, diction, choice of words, i.e. verbs, adjectives, and nouns, as we looked at in grammar last year, are all important elements. So even the grammar starts coming into descriptive writing, and a very important element of mechanics. The description that we had before was sort of absent or super minimal in the 2D flat exteriorized world of fairy tales. However, description characterizes realism, and Gothic in lots of ways seems to be a meeting of the fairy tale world with this sort of new realistic world with interior life. So we have to build upon our characterization and our characters by putting more flesh on the bones. And authors will be doing this too, as we'll have a little look at. Figurative language, with some things which are maybe not strictly figurative language, starting off by pointing up a few ideas. And I'm not going to a simile is as good as gold, as red as blood, is a comparison with one thing with another thing, which is not, then they're not the two same things, which can have a particular effect. A simile could also be combined with hyperbole or exaggeration. So you could say he's as big as a giant, and he's not, he's only about this big. That would create irony, which I'm not dealing with here at the moment. We're going to get into later. So similes can have a large effect, and we can use them and we can see them in use. And so the reading and writing really are two interlinked skills on that level. A metaphor and metaphorical language is really a comparison through substitution. So you say one thing simply is another. My love is a rose is a very simple metaphor. So they take linguistic forms that are slightly different, and we can look for similes and metaphors, and we can think about using them in characterization and description as we move from the fairy tale and the two-dimensional into the more descriptive and three-dimensional. Lots of Gothic writing does use figures of sound quite strongly as well. These are figurative language, figures of speech, but we've got alliteration as well. You could also deal with assonance. Alliteration would be consonant sounds at the beginning of, normally at the beginning of words being the same. They can be vowel sounds as well. Big, bold as brass, billy, bounded is a very sort of simple and primitive sort of form of alliteration. You can also have vowel sounds within words making similar sounds in patterns. This is very, very strong. It can sometimes be interpreted as being quite cheesy, but at the same time it can have a very strong effect, and it's worth looking for, building up as like these blocks in conventions, and then it enables you as a writer, and it will enable children as writers. Personification is quite important here as well. It's whether non-human becomes human or is described in human terms. I've already pointed to the fact that part of that is a strong point of Gothic fiction, which would be done in describing a setting, which we equally could have done here, because the pathetic fallacy gives the castle a sort of human emotions and characteristics and traits. Anthropomorphism is where animals take on human characteristics and traits, but this is a form of figurative language that will is definitely you'll be able to identify in Gothic fiction. I'm just starting out now with some of these ideas. Just going to quickly, before we go on, go back and just say, okay, what did we just do? We said that there are stock characters that we can look at, and some useful names that are mostly left over from Greek drama as ideas. So they change in time. So we've got these ideas of anti-heroes, and a protagonist is quite strong and useful as a term. We've got different forms of characterization which are linked to how the story is told, who's the narrator, and what perspective you see things from. So these are very important elements. Direct characterization, where you have a third person narrator, might be one of the chief forms of characterization. The narrator may just introduce a character and tell you, the reader, what that character is like. However, indirect characterization could be when the character itself shows you how they are. And we use the Steele mnemonic of speech, thoughts, effects on other actions and looks. We also discussed chronological, spatial, and order of importance as ways of organizing information. Then we looked at literal language, sensory description, feelings and the interior life, different ways of dealing with sentence length, using verbs to create mood and precision in language. And then we looked at figurative language with similes, metaphors, hyperbole, which is exaggeration, alliteration, and personification. So what we're going to do now, let's have a look. We're about 20 minutes in for you following on YouTube. So we're going to have a little look, first of all, at this character reading. I think we'll start off here. Look at Sonny Baudelaire of the Baudelaires from The Bad Beginning, Lemony Snicket, a series of unfortunate events. We're going to read this and just have a little I'll do a little commentary for you, just a few little points. And then I'm going to send you away into your groups, give you a little bit of time to try and look and analyze yourselves as well. And then I will give you task 2 to complete in terms of writing. If either A, you're super fast and you think you're ready, or B, you can do it yourselves as homework and submit in your own time, starting on the writing process. And then we'll go on to reading skills at the end as well, if we've got time for that as well. Hopefully do a sort of 10-15 minute presentation. Sonny Baudelaire, the youngest, liked to bite things. She was an infant and very small for her age, scarcely larger than a boot. What she lacked in size, however, she made up for with the size and sharpness of her 4 teeth. Sonny was at an age where one mostly speaks in a series of unintelligible shrieks, except when she used the few actual words in her vocabulary, like bottle, mummy, and bite. Most people had trouble understanding what it was that Sonny was saying. For instance, this morning she was saying, "Gack," over and over, which probably meant, "Look at that mysterious figure emerging from the fog." Oh, I love the way that paragraph, which is the third in a series of paragraphs that introduce Violet, Klaus, and Sonny, who are our 3 protagonists, really, in that they work together as a team with their different individual sort of talents. Klaus being bookish. Annika's just there going, foreshadowing. Annika's, not Annika, not you. Violet is inventive and resourceful, isn't she? Klaus is bookish and is good at learning, and Sonny bites things. But you can see that I love that. What almost feels like a trope at the end. The narrator is sort of telling us that we're imagining what she might be saying, so we're sort of accessing an interior world and sort of feelings. But it's kind of it's kind of indirect characterization through speech, but it's not her speech. Her speech is gack. But we've got this gothic sort of image or motif of a mysterious figure emerging from the fog. And back again to that fog. It's sort of leaking over from Dickens' Bleak House, no doubt, at the moment. We've got primarily a narrator, a third person, telling us about a character and giving us literally a paragraph for that introduction. Some of those parts are then repeated through the text, but there's 3 paragraphs in a row where there's a direct characterization of the Baudelaire children. If we look quite quickly, we've got sort of this sentence length of this very succinct, liked to bite things here as well, and this is often repeated almost as a sort of a little refrain through the text, and it's very short, just like a bite, a sharp nip would be as well. So it's quite precise in terms of language, and it's pacey, because you can imagine her bite would be unexpected, but then quite sudden, and I'd imagine quite hard. It's interestingly told in the past tense. She was. Small for her age is technically not a simile, but here we have one scarcely larger than a boot. So we go from what is a literal language and a literal description. She was very small for her age, an infant, and then we go on to a simile with a very nice little sort of simile comparison, scarcely larger than a boot. And so the one thing, the Baudelaire child, Sunny, is compared with the other. The two things are not the same, and we have the boot there. Works quite nicely, I think, and it's fun to say. And we can see in that sentence, if you want to as well, she was an infant, very small for her age, scarcely larger than a boot. So you've got those she, small, scarcely. We've got these S sounds coming through. If we're going to talk about assonance and alliteration, that there are repeated sounds through it. The sentences are rather quite long, and they have connectors, which we remember from expository and persuasive writing, don't we? So we know that this is kind of formal in register, isn't it? Where what she lacked in size, however, she made up for with the size and sharpness of her four teeth. Again, this is lovely writing. Excuse me. Sunny was an age where one mostly speaks in a series of unintelligible shrieks. Oh, okay. Well, we're recording, so you can keep up. Don't worry. Task 1 and 2 from the list, please, Renata. Here we've got Sunny speaks in a series of unintelligible shrieks. We've got a repeated use of S sounds all through this sentence, which is quite nice and works very well. And then we've got an evocative verb, not only an evocative verb, which sort of conjures up this sort of sound, but it's almost one of the things I didn't put in there is it's onomatopoeic, which is, we'll put that up in one of the slides later. It actually sounds like the sound itself, the word. You can imagine shriek, except when she used the few actual words in her vocabulary. I'll put this up on the 502 side as well. There's a constant sort of theme and motif of understanding words and explaining them throughout the series of unfortunate events. We'll see if we can find some examples, but very often words are explained by the narrator, which is an interesting little device. How she affects others, here again in some form of what we could say, even though it's being told by the narrator. So it is a form of direct characterization. We've kind of got this sense of understanding that nobody understands her. And then we've got this thing about what she might be thinking or saying or feeling or experiencing. And then we've got this lovely Gothic trope at the end as well. So it's an interesting piece of characterization. It's quite effective. At times it feels difficult to know whether it's chronological, because she goes from an infant, but it seems to be all a sort of description at sort of at one time. It's very little sort of spatial elements. If you look at the organization, until you've got this very sort of clear image of somebody coming out of the fog, and then we've got shrieks. I'm not sure if it is in terms of order of importance, but if we're looking at it in terms of how it's organized, then of course, there we go. She liked to bite things, liked his feelings, and that seems to be the most important fact about Sunny Baudelaire. In that sense, she seems at first to be kind of almost like a 2D fairy tale character a little bit, this Sunny, she bites stuff. But then what we've got built on top of that is a depth of characterization. Okay, we're at past already. Possibly time for me to set you off into a task then. Having looked at number 1 and just to sort of discussed and thought about it a little bit, I've also popped in. Now you can go and look for your own if you have books to the fore, because you might like to look at the books that you've got if you have them already, and just quickly see at the beginning how the characters, what sort of characterization there is. I've included from just further down on the next page. Um, I love Count Olaf, and Carey is very good in the film version, very well worth seeing. The paragraph that introduces Count Olaf, and I've also included, though I do realize now that both of these are actually from the 102 side, but it doesn't matter. This out of interest because this is the Queen from The Sleeper and the Spindle, and obviously what we have here is we have a fairy tale. But it's a fairy tale which is not a traditional fairy tale and that has been sort of mashed up and rewritten. And so it's interesting to see what do you think it would be as a fairy tale, what you'd expect in terms of genre conventions, and what you get out of here in terms of the fact that does that make it more of a gothic um, piece of fiction, because we do find out about her interior life. There we go. We even got the little moniker that each hammer blow sounded like a heartbeat. So let me just show you the task quickly, because and then I will set the time as we go through. I'm going to go into syllabus. I'm going to go down. It's very quiet out there today. Everybody intently listening or just doing other stuff. Where are we? We're there. And that's today. We've got Gothic fiction, female Gothic, conventions of Gothic, setting, supernatural, curses, prophecies, heroines and damsels in distress, intense emotion. Yes, yeah, I'd like to hear about that. Perhaps you can tell me. I can imagine it looked like there was a hell of a lot of handouts going on there, and it was probably quite a rough ride of a start in the morning. So don't worry, chill. You're good. You're good. You've done so many tasks for me that I can rock and roll with it. I think we'll just deal with the descriptive writing today, which is something I really want to work with as much as possible, because I thought it was lacking previously, working with descriptive writing and narrative writing, and it's really does help you develop a proper voice. And so many of you are good at it already. So we're going to do those top bits. We're going to look at descriptive writing, character, indirect and direct characterization, and imagery. We'll leave reading skills, I think, for next time. And there's task one. You can go into your pre-existing groups or find new groups. I'm very happy for you to self-organize or sit with your group at the moment. We'll keep it nice and low key. Characterization, reading, and then there was a task based on it for writing. Choose a character description from a set text from module 1, or use the ones in the PowerPoint where I've given you the Queen and Count Olaf. Identify characterization as direct or indirect. Use steal the mnemonic and look at use of imagery. Set that up in a Google Docs, and groups. You can put it in the folder, please. And if you put it as lit2, then you'll know it's a separate task to the last task, or you can put it as characterization if you like as well. And then for this one at least, I'd like you at the end to just at the end either organize your notes and then have a structured discussion. Keep it tight. Make sure you can say what we're going to say, and then you can record that in OmniJoin and submit to the Google Drive. Just may as well show you this right now. Part 2 was to actually create or select a character building on the sort of fairy tales that we started, the mashups we did last week, and thinking about maybe exploring that character like Neil Gaiman does and building it into a gothic character with some sort of interior life and psychology like Coraline, and maybe trying different forms of characterization and seeing what that happens. Then that was to then write and maybe draw a character as well, just for a bit of fun, and submit in Google in the Google Drive. But I'd be very happy at the moment if we just do task 1. Okay, task 2 is there for you. Please put that in your blogs, submit at any point. I think this is that's the follow-on task, and we'll see how much time we have next time to continue in that vein. Okay, so if everybody's happy to go into the same groups, maybe for ease of use, I'm presuming you probably used the same groups this morning. or you can stay in your groups from this morning if you had groups. I'm going to give you until end of class, more or less. So if you've got about 20-25 minutes, task 2 is there. I don't think really I would love to be able to do that because I wanted to do writing, but you've got to do the reading first to be able to do the writing. So just do task 1 unless you're super snappy, but I don't think you will be able to. You've got to look at it, you've got to talk about it, read it out loud, discuss it, apply some of the terms and vocabulary with the scaffolding, and then ideally just do a short, very short, pointed, structured discussion at the end where you record yourselves. I think that's enough. So let's reconvene at 1500. Gosh, you're pushing it, aren't you? So you can just stay in the same groups. Very happy at the moment. I'm not reassembling at the moment. Yeah, double question mark. Stay in the same groups. Cool. And you may. What I'm saying is that we might struggle to have time to do task 2 in a future lesson because we've got more stuff to do. If you can do task 2, that would be great. Those of you who enjoyed the writing, there might be a lot of that where I give you combination of tasks and there will be tasks hanging. I'm not saying they're obligatory, I'm just saying they're part of this lesson pack. And if they're there, they're there as extra work for those people who want to investigate it and explore, etc. But I'm not going to come around knocking at your house saying, where is it? Okay. So ideally, yes, please do it. That would be great. But I don't think we've got time to do it right now. So reconvene at 1500. Off we go. And into your existing groups. Task 1. Characterization reading. Go. I'm going to stop the video there as well. For those of you on YouTube, there is a bit of a debate there. There are 2 tasks connected to the lecture today. They're 2 very good tasks, and you can think about how you use reading and how reading and writing are. They're a collection of very similar schemata or sort of genre conventions and expectations, and so they go hand in hand. And what we've done is we're looking at other people's characterization in task 1, and in task 2 we're trying to play around with that characterization ourselves. Now we've had limited time in the lesson today, but that's definitely something that would be well worth completing. You can hand it in and I will give feedback before next week's lesson. And that would continue in the process really of strengthening your writing and allowing you to think about literature and creative writing at the same time and improve all other forms of your writing and language. So I'd warmly recommend that to be done. We'll look at reading skills for those of you on YouTube. I will probably do this. Yes, they've all left and they don't know what's going on. So while they've gone, just checking. Off you go. I don't know, they might be hanging out in the room, but while they've gone, what I'm going to do, YouTubers, is I'm going to just go through the rest of the handout with you. So it's done and it's recorded. How's about that? That's cool, Mona. No worries. I'm also at work. So just scary. This I find reasonably unnerving. Reading skills, and I've sort of labeled this reluctant readers because it's just a massive sort of question, isn't it? The first for me real sort of a major question. Munden, and Santiago Munden, their chapters, they talk about this idea of it's just about motivation. And number 1 obviously is to either find cool stuff that has meaning for children, and we'll look at Dr. Judy Willis's ideas about how boredom, and lack of meaning stresses teenagers, and how it's important to understand that. But last week we were looking at DC and Ryan. We think about motivation in terms of amounts, so I'm just going to do this again, reiterate it and bring it back in. And DC says in that the YouTube clip, which has been linked to the module, it was important to think about types of motivation rather than amount. And just here as well, we have to think about, okay, how are we motivating, and what sort of different types of motivation do we have? Do we have different reading strategies then that can reflect those different types of motivation? So I'm going to draw quite heavily on Munden and Sandhaug here, but I'm sort of interweaving it in my mind with DC and Ryan and their self-determination theory and intrinsic, extrinsic, and integrative motivation. I've also starting to think about reading strategies in terms of when we look at literature this term, and when you do course requirement 2 for literature about presenting and adapting a book for use in the classroom, that you have to think clearly in terms of whether you're going to use a bottom-up approach in terms of intensive reading, where you go from the details, from sort of words to sentence to language structure, as an approach to. Oh, I have to just okay this very quickly. Oh no, seems fine. 2 seconds. As opposed to extensive reading, which we've been discussing. We've been thinking about extensive writing, extensive reading, extensive and intensive learning as a top-down approach, which means that you understand it as a text and you ask questions like, what format is this? What type of text is this? Which we talked about looking back at sort of expository and persuasive writing. What type of text is this? We haven't really looked at types because we will be discussing as we go along. Is there a genre? Are there conventions involved here? Do we understand that schemata? Or there's the schema or plural schemata? Munden also mentions skimming, going through to sort of summarize and understand something, and scanning as important reading strategies, looking for particular pieces of information in text. These are quite important strategies because they're also strategies that are probably used in assessment, aren't they? That you might skim a text just to make sure and sort of get an overall impression in a sort of top-down sense, and then you might scan a text looking for details that you want to pick out, information, or obviously things that you think might need attention. So reading strategies could be broken up into sort of pre-reading, while reading, if you like, post-reading. There could be other terms for these as well. And we're going to look at, just quickly, going to sort of summarize some of the points, particularly that are made by Munden and Sandhaug. So I'm not going elsewhere at the moment for too many ideas for this, but I'm going to sort of just throw out some ideas that I sort of listed of things that I've tried in my time in classrooms. Pre-reading activities, and I'm trying to keep this nice and simple, and this could work from down in year 4 when you're beginning with sort of reading strategies, but even from your very first text. You get a book and you look at the cover. What's the title? The Last Man. What does that tell me about the book? It creates an expectation and a sort of attention almost immediately as well. What type of text is this? Here I'm looking at Frankenstein. I understand it's a universal picture. It's a beautiful, beautiful illustration there for it must be. Is that Carl Lemley? Is it in Frankenstein? But if we're looking at text as well, so this text would obviously, again, do we know what the text involved here is? It's actually a film script is the text. It's a screenplay. Pictures and illustrations, if we're looking here as well. I have monster fiction. I have what looks like almost Fay Ray, or like a classic damsel in distress with the monster. Is the monster going to be a beast, a villain? Because he looks like one. He definitely looks like one. However, I wonder if the monster might turn out to actually to be able to demonstrate the more sort of nobler aspect of human nature, and be a hero, not like an anti-hero who doesn't behave heroically, but actually sort of heroic in that sense. Frankenstein's monster in the original he philosophizes, and he's incredibly articulate. We could have a sample of the text, which we can see we've got some in here as well. Quotes maybe from the text could be a sample from a film text. Here it says the man who made a monster. It's quite funny because we don't see that man, and that's quite interesting. It makes you think that possibly, if I'm looking at it here, not as a school child, but maybe for me personally, that who is the man that made the monster, and why is he not there? It makes it almost feel as if he is the monster. And the question is who is the monster, isn't it? The eternal question that you can ask in any situation. Who is it that's weird? Who is it that's the abnormal? We've got headings and headlines. Here we've got headlines obviously across this kind of poster, but you could look within a book and within a text and look at stage instructions and subdivisions, acts, and all sorts of things, scene titles. Dealing with a group who would be looking at this, you might want to know what they know. Their various schemata is the word we've been putting in there, their preconceived ideas or little sort of units of knowledge about what's expected here. We've got some sort of laboratory, haven't we? Whether it can be considered. She looks like a flapper girl from the 1920s. So this kind of feels like, I don't know, a sort of jazz age almost version of Frankenstein, as if it's going to be sort of Art Deco. And however, behind we've got the skeleton, and we've got this sort of very interesting. I don't know what that item is over there. It looks like it's some sort of distilling vial that looks quite mysterious. They might know about films. They might know about the monster. Anybody might know about Frankenstein without ever having seen it. You could guess what's going to happen from this as well, couldn't you? I didn't actually choose this picture, by the way, to do this. I just shoved it in there, and now I'm just doing it straight off. So this has worked out quite well, really, in terms of its strong intertextuality and its the sort of the cultural schemata of knowing monster fiction and who Frankenstein is, even though we seemingly don't know who Frankenstein is. A bit like Coraline and Caroline. You could guess words that are going to be in it. You could guess content. He's a monster. It's alive. It's really a sort of non-scientific drama of electricity as some sort of life-giving force as well, isn't it, in terms of what Victor does. And it's in a very strong frame narrative with a series of letters. That's the bit of the original film that's lost. It was reinserted in Kenneth Branagh's 1994 Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with Robert De Niro as the monster. For me, I could never really see De Niro as being Frankenstein's monster, but perhaps there's something in that, I don't know. Discuss, go and see what you think of it. What do they want to know about it? Are there comprehension questions due them before? So you've got a whole host of pre-reading activities, and you can see already how you can interact with texts there. Munden and Sandhaug, it's also pretty much a very similar chapter in Munden for those of you who have that from the 1 to 7 group. Suggest while reading activities, basically saying that reading aloud in front of the whole class, which is something that I traditionally did, I love doing actually, because I was in charge. So I enjoyed it. You can see this graded children's classic over here of Jane Eyre, with this sort of Gothic mansion enshrouded in fog in that setting. You see straight away what kind of expectations you might have from this kind of film. Her bonnet, the red bonnet here, somehow makes me think of The Scarlet Letter and The Handmaid's Tale. Interesting. But reading stations is one way of breaking up texts, keeping people mobile. So this is quite interesting, actually, where you could even, if you're thinking about, let's just take Jane Eyre because that's there. Again, I didn't do this, but it's there. Let's say you wanted to take bits from different parts of the text and get them to go and read them and then think about it. It would be like a discovery, and that could work quite well, even with quite a complex text, to be honest. So instead of reading aloud, you're going from stations, and maybe there you could be reading in turns, going sentence to sentence. So you have almost deconstructed text, but you build a relationship between a pair or maybe threes reading together and negotiating it. You can also peer assess and support each other. You can also script sections into readers' theatre, where they actually work on a piece of text. Here you could do Jane Eyre, perhaps the meeting with the mad woman in the attic up in the wing, or you could perhaps a blinded Rochester being reunited with Jane Eyre, or the Red Room from her aunt's house in her childhood. And you could try and practice and make these into some sort of play performance. There's some good details there in that chapter on reading and understanding texts. Of course, extensive reading just says just reading. And I don't think we should be scared of that in classroom activities. I think often as teachers we feel like we should be doing more. But what more could you be doing than having a child sit there and read Jane Eyre? Not for me. Good night. That's all from me. Um, Munden and Santag also propose here with the lovely Caroline or Coraline, possibly misheard. Another name confusion, which can be an important part of the Gothic, you can see as well, but it's a way of framing texts with more information. This book is not just a text, there's a name confusion inherent, and you'll see that in quite a few of the books. Jane Eyre itself also seems to be a play on words. Um, Post-reading activities, some of the suggestions: make a poster to make it into an art project, 3 I know sentences that you can write about it, 3 I wonder sentences, asking questions of it. You could go for 3 I feel sentences, pick out 3 words or phrases, and that could be done not only with our simplest, sorry about that, the younger children. I don't see why you could not do the 3 phrases out of a text all the way up to university level, and it would make sense, as well as the poster. I personally think that, for example, teaching philosophy, and when my daughter has been doing it, she's in year 9 now in IB school. I've had her doing pictures, particularly to try and sort of remember certain philosophers. You can ask about intertext and how it relates to other stories. We might think about Frankenstein we just had there, or I already tried to intertextualize Jane Eyre very quickly, didn't I? There are text in a text, post-reading activities, a letter from a character, and I'm going to extemporize on that in detail in a minute if I have time, because I'm aware of the fact that we're actually reconvening very, very shortly. Yeah, it's whole screen, that's fine. It's all being recorded. Recounts of story retells could be very, very useful in language learning. Word clouds, which you can do manually as well as using computer-generated programs. And of course, drama work is something that's multisensory and is a fantastic way to work with books, is to act out scenes, rather like reader's theatre, but even more advanced. And then you can change those scenes, add conventions and drop conventions. Wow, one hell of a picture from Ransom Riggs. I think Munden and Sandhaug asked the question, well, if you do extensive reading, what happens afterwards? Because they wanted to, people, instead of testing them, like, asking something of them, do you still get them to do stuff? And number one answer, which I wrote and I've just put in myself, which is nothing, capital letters, go away. Because reading for reading's sake is a fantastic project. But we've got other classic examples: write a dust jacket blurb or similar, make a trailer, twiterature, tweet plot summaries, suggest hashtags, write online reviews, drama, intertexts. All of these, we need to very clearly remember that for some people, motivation is autonomous and intrinsic, and that is the goal, to have learner autonomy because they have interest in enjoyment and value. 2 minutes, Louise, I'll just be back. Whereas normally, especially in intensive reading as well, they are not given choice in what they're doing, and so it's extrinsic and in controlled motivation. However, hopefully through a variety of tasks and clever strategies, we might be able to commute that controlled extrinsic motivation into internalized extrinsic or integrative motivation, and that is the goal. Got a couple of things. You can look at these later on yourself. I just quickly last night, I was on a flight into Bardufoss. I just started doing a note on my phone, and it turned into about 3 slides of stuff that I've done with classes, games based on game shows like Would I Lie to You, or what it's not about. So by not describing the conventions, what won't happen in the book, things characters from the book won't say, you can't get these wrong. That's the important thing, and that they allow you to navigate and negotiate genre conventions in a way that builds up literacy, textual literacy. I'll pick out something else quickly. Movie news or book news, an internal news service from a book. Follow a scene from a film, match description like we just did to close-ups, wide shots, tracking shots. So you can go to close-ups and you can start going to possible feelings, for example. So you can change on your forms of description and characterization according to how you think it should be. A tracking shot which follows goes into first person. Does that do something differently? So it's a use of film technique, done that quite extensively. Very little time left. A roast a character from a book or a text. Funeral address or obituary. Ooh, macabre and slightly gothic. Love little twists on things like that as well. Perhaps one where you confess that you were yourself the murderer because you're a serial killer and you're only in it for the attention. Improv, make up directions from genre conventions and get people to try and act them out. You can see some terribly embarrassing ones in here as well. Trailers, iMovie, you'll see many of those on the internet. Character tweets, nonsense similes, they don't work. Use about characters. The whole thing is to get it wrong, to practice not. Nonsense metaphors, I am not. So metaphors that definitely don't work. Also, gosh, all sorts of bits going on here as well. Sports commentary on a scene of a text or film. Absolutely funny. It's the opening paragraph. You can hear the reader's excitement, and they're off. Just a few ideas that I was thinking through as we go through this session, but it's time for me to call it a day there as we're at 3 o'clock and we're an hour gone. So it's goodbye to you, YouTubers. Goodbye to everybody following the course. And I'll see you in the next module, which is on picture books. Make it so.